My name is Fiona Slater, and I was 34 the night my fiancé's family tried to buy my silence with the price of my own name. It happened at the rehearsal dinner in a country club dining room, with 60 guests watching, when my future mother-in-law slid a folded document across the white tablecloth and said, loudly enough for the back tables to hear, that I should sign it because I was a gold digger who had brought nothing to their family. I read every line. Then I picked up the pen, and they all leaned in, certain they knew exactly how this story would end. They thought the folder sitting in front of me was empty. What I did next, with that pen already in my hand, and why my father-in-law, seated at the far end of the table, nearly came out of his chair, is the part none of them ever saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quietest woman at the table is usually the one holding the whole thing together. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have known your worth, you are among friends here. Drop a comment and subscribe, because to understand what happened with that pen, you have to go back to a truck, a pair of worn leather gloves, and everything I taught myself to hide. I own a company called Slater Grounds, a commercial landscaping and snow removal business. The kind of work nobody photographs until it fails. 12 years ago, it was one used truck, a second-hand mower, and me answering the phone in a parking lot. Today, it's 40 trucks, 90 employees, and contracts across 3 counties, including hospitals, corporate campuses, and the interstate medians the state pays us to keep clear. When it snows at 2 o'clock in the morning, my crews are the reason thousands of people still make it to work. That business made me a wealthy woman, though you would never guess it by looking at me. I drive a 2009 pickup with a dented tailgate. I wear the same flannel shirts I wore when I was 22 and broke. My hands are still rough because I get out and pull weeds myself when a job falls behind. Money, to me, has always been something you build and then keep quiet about. I learned that young, and I learned it the hard way. Every time someone in my life discovered what I had, something changed in their face. The math started, and the asking followed. Friends turned into people with proposals. One boyfriend once told me I made him feel small, then made sure I felt even smaller. So I became very good at looking like I had nothing. I paid for things without flinching and let people assume the flinch was there. I told myself it was humility. Really, it was armor. I had learned that the fastest way to lose people was to let them see how much you had. And for most of my life, that armor worked exactly the way I needed it to. Then I met a man who never once asked what I earned. The armor began with my grandmother. She raised me after my parents were no longer able to. She cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and never once acted as though it made her less than the people whose floors she scrubbed. She had a pair of leatherwork gloves, cracked and soft from years of use, that she wore for everything. The garden, the gutters, even the old lawn mower she kept running long past the point when anyone else would have replaced it. When I was little and complained that we didn't have what other families had, she would hold up those gloves and tell me something I didn't understand until much later. Worth isn't inherited, she would say. It's built. You make it with these, and nobody can take it back across the table. She died when I was 19, and she left me almost nothing anyone could deposit in a bank. She left me the gloves. I started the company 3 years after her funeral with those gloves in the truck's glove box, and I've carried them to every important day of my life ever since. They were in my pocket the day I signed my first 6-figure contract. They were in my pocket the day I paid off my last loan. They still smell like her if I press them to my face, which I do more often than I would ever admit to anyone. I built everything I have with my own 2 hands because the woman who raised me showed me how. That was the part the Ashfords could never have known as they sat in their country club beneath their name on the library wall. They believed a person's value came stamped on them at birth. My grandmother taught me that it came off your hands. I met Ethan Ashford at 6 o'clock in the morning in a parking lot covered in 8 inches of fresh snow. He taught history at the high school my company plowed, and he had come out early to help shovel the walkways before the buses arrived, even though no teacher was paid to do it. I found him doing it wrong, hurting his back, so I showed him the right way to throw snow so it wouldn't come back down on him. We talked for 20 minutes while my crew finished clearing the lot. He didn't ask exactly what I did for a living. Instead, he asked what I liked to read. When I told him, his face lit up, and he named a book I loved. We stood there in the cold, arguing about the ending until his fingers turned white. He was gentle in a way I wasn't used to. He wore a coat with a patch at the elbow and didn't seem to care. He looked at me like I was interesting, not like I was a set of numbers he was trying to add up. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I had to shrink. I didn't feel the armor click into place. I gave him my number, which I almost never did, and I told myself it was because he taught history and had kind eyes. Really, it was because he had spent 20 minutes with me and never once asked the question that always ruined everything. He never asked me what I was worth. 2 years later I understood why. In his world, they only asked that question about people they had already decided to reject. I knew the name Ashford before I knew Ethan. Everyone in the county did. It was carved above the entrance to the town library and displayed beneath the oldest portraits in the Historical Society. Men in high collars who had owned the mill before the mill closed. The Ashfords were what people in that town meant when they said, old family. Not necessarily rich in any way you could immediately see, but established. The kind of name that got you a table without a reservation and a nod from people who didn't nod easily. Ethan carried that name like a coat that didn't quite fit. He had deliberately left the family orbit, taken the teaching job his mother considered beneath them, and built a small life that was entirely his own. When he was with me, he seemed lighter, like a man who had finally set something heavy down. "It's why I love you," he told me once, early in our relationship. "You have no idea who my family is, and you wouldn't care if you did." I laughed and told him he was right. I didn't care about the portraits or the library wall, but even then I noticed how carefully he said, "my family," the way you might name a weather system moving toward the coast. I asked him once what it had been like growing up inside that name. He went quiet. Then he said something I filed away without understanding for a long time. "There's nothing more expensive than a family that has run out of everything but its name." I thought it was just a poet's line. I didn't know yet that it was a warning, or that I was about to walk straight into the middle of it. Our first dinner was at the family lake house, a large shingled place that had clearly been grand once and was now tired in ways I noticed but pretended not to. Margaret Ashford met me at the door wearing pearls and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She held my hand a second too long, looked at my clean but unremarkable coat, and asked warmly who I did the gardening for. I told her, "I work in landscaping." She replied, "You mean you work in landscaping?" As if she were correcting a child's grammar, and her smile never moved. At dinner, Ethan's sister, Vivian, leaned toward me with the interest of a woman conducting a survey. "And what does your family do?" she asked. "Are they local?" I said, "My grandmother raised me and she passed away." "Oh," Vivian replied, and let the silence do the rest. They were kind in the way a closed door is polished. Every question had a floor beneath it, and the floor was always the same. "Where do you come from, and is it anywhere?" I sat there with a company that plowed half the county operating under my own name, and I said, "None of it." I let them believe the truck in the driveway was all there was. Ethan squeezed my hand beneath the table as if he were proud of how well I was handling it. I told myself I was being gracious. The truth was uglier and older. It was worse than that. I was doing what I had always done. I was making myself smaller so they wouldn't have a reason to send me away. I was auditioning for a part one didn't even realize had already been cast. And here's the thing I need you to understand, because without it, none of what I allowed to happen will make sense. I did not want the Ashfords' money. There was no money to want, though I didn't know that yet. What I wanted was the table. I wanted to belong somewhere that had existed before me and would continue long after me. I grew up with a grandmother, a rented duplex, and no cousins filling the house during the holidays. No huge, loud family arguing over football or fighting over the last serving of mashed potatoes. I built a company because I was good at building things out of nothing. But you can't build a family out of nothing. You have to be let in. So when Ethan took me back to that snowy parking lot on our anniversary and dropped to one knee with a plain gold ring he'd saved 3 months of a teacher's salary to buy, I didn't think about his mother. I thought about having a place to belong. I said yes before he even finished asking. I said yes to him, and somewhere deep in my heart, I thought I was also saying yes to them, to the portraits, the library wall, and Sunday dinners for the rest of my life. That was the wound speaking, though I couldn't hear it then. A woman who has spent her whole life standing outside a door will do almost anything to be invited inside. She will shrink. She will hide. She will sit quietly while people who owe her nothing decide over cocktails whether she deserves a chair. I said yes, and I drove home that night happier than I had been in years. I had no idea I had just handed them the one thing they knew how to use against me. Margaret asked to see the ring the way a jeweler asks to inspect a flaw. She turned my hand toward the window, studied the modest gold band, and said, "How practical," in a tone that made practical sound like the worst word in the language. Then she got to work. Within a week, she had appointed herself the planner of a wedding I had never asked her to plan. It would be at the club, of course. The Ashfords had always married at the club. The guest list would be handled by her because there were people who had to be invited, people whose grandfathers had known Ethan's grandfather. When I mentioned that I wanted to invite my crew, the men and women who had helped me build my life, she smiled and said, "We'll see about space." Everything I wanted was something they would see about. Everything they wanted was already decided. I watched a wedding that was supposed to be mine turn into a performance of a family I was allowed to attend but not alter. And I let it happen because pushing back felt like giving them a reason to reject me. If you've ever sat at a table where your welcome came with a list of conditions, you already know the sound of that particular silence. The silence where you swallow the thing you meant to say. Stay with me because that silence is about to get very, very loud. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe because sometimes these stories reach the exact people who need to hear them only after the algorithm has tried to hide them. I told myself I could earn my way in if I was patient enough. I was about to learn that the door had a completely different purpose than I thought. What followed were the tests. Nobody called them tests, but that's exactly what they were. Small, constant, deniable. At the next dinner, Margaret watched which fork I reached for and corrected me with nothing more than a look before I could touch the wrong one. When I mentioned a movie I loved, Vivian said, "Oh, that's fun," in the same voice people use for a child's drawing. Whenever I spoke, Margaret would wait a beat and then repeat what I'd said in slightly more polished English, as if she were translating me for the room. I have negotiated contracts with men who tried to bury me in fine print, and I have never felt as managed as I did at that table. Every little correction carried the same message underneath, patient and absolute. You are not one of us. You can visit. You cannot stay. And the cruelty of it was that none of it was ever loud enough to name. If I had said, "Your mother keeps insulting me," Ethan could have honestly replied, "She was just talking about forks." That was the design. Death by 1,000 forks. I started dreading the drive to the lake house. I began rehearsing sentences in the truck, trying to sound like someone they wouldn't need to correct. I had never rehearsed a thing in my life. I once told a county commissioner exactly where he could put his lowball offer. Yet there I was, sitting in my own truck practicing how to become smaller. I didn't see it happening. That's how it works. Doesn't feel like disappearing. Feels like manners. Feels like love. It even feels like the price you pay to be allowed inside. And with every dinner, without realizing it, I paid a little more of myself across that table. Eventually I said something to Ethan on the drive home one night. Not an accusation. Just a small, careful truth. "Your mother doesn't like me." He sighed the tired sigh of a man who had been managing that particular weather system his entire life. "She's like that with everyone," he said. "Give her time. She'll warm up. Just don't give her anything to hold on to." I asked him what that meant. He hesitated. "You know, don't make waves. Let her run the wedding. It's easier." I stared out the window at the dark trees sliding past and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. I had wanted him to say, "She's wrong about you and I will make her stop." Instead, he was asking me to be quieter, to fit into a smaller space, to hand his mother the wheel so the ride would be smooth. And the terrible part was that I understood. Ethan had spent 36 years learning that the only way to survive Margaret Ashford was to give her no edges to grab. He wasn't betraying me. He was teaching me to do what he had done. But I didn't want to survive her. I wanted him to stand in front of me. He kept asking me to be smaller, and I kept getting smaller, telling myself it was love. That night, lying awake, I finally let the thought finish itself. The man I was going to marry had never once, in 2 years, stood between me and his family. He loved me in every quiet way there was. He just couldn't seem to do it out loud. And I was beginning to wonder what would happen on the day quiet wasn't enough. Then Vivian invited me to coffee. Just us girls, she said, so we could get to know each other before the wedding. I should have known better. She arrived with a leather folder and a smile, spending the first 10 minutes being warmer than she had ever been. Then the questions started, and they were not the questions of a woman getting to know her future sister-in-law. Where do you live exactly? Do you own or rent? Ethan mentioned you have a truck. Is that what you use for the business? How many people work for you, roughly? Is it just seasonal? She was mapping me. Every answer went into that folder behind her eyes, and I could see her doing the arithmetic. The same arithmetic I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. But it was running backward from what I expected. She wasn't trying to find out how much I had. She was trying to confirm how little. She wanted to establish for the record that I was a woman with a truck, a seasonal job, no family, and no money. A woman who could only be marrying Ethan for one reason. I gave her small, true, incomplete answers and watched her decide that I was exactly what she had come to prove. Yes, I said. Just a truck. Just a small operation. I let her write the story she wanted. I don't fully know why. Part of it was the old armor. The reflex to look like less. Part of it was something colder and newer. The sense that I was being investigated and that whatever they were building, I didn't yet want them to know what I actually was. I drove home certain of one thing. That coffee had not been a welcome. It had been discovery. And discovery is what you do before trial. I heard the word for the first time through a door I wasn't supposed to be behind. It was another dinner. And I'd gone looking for a bathroom through a hallway I didn't know when I heard Margaret's voice coming from the study, low and certain in a way she never sounded in front of guests. We need to protect the family, she was saying. Vivian answered, but I couldn't catch what she said. Then Margaret spoke again, clear as a bell. She's clearly after what's left. A gold digger. Plain as that. Some women see a name and smell an opportunity. I stood in that dark hallway with my hand against the wall and didn't move. Gold digger. The words sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I had spent my entire life so afraid of being wanted for my money that I'd hidden it from the world. And here was a woman deciding I was a thief for money I'd never touched and didn't need. But it was 3 other words that kept me standing there in the dark. What's left? What's left? You don't say that about a full account. You say it about something being drained. You say it about the bottom of something. I turned that strange, revealing little phrase over and over in my mind, and for the first time since I had met the Ashfords, I felt the ground shift beneath the story I'd been told about them. They had a name on a library wall, portraits in the Historical Society, and a lake house slowly growing tired at the seams. And somewhere inside that study, the matriarch of it all was guarding what was left. I returned to the table, smiled, and began paying very close attention. I didn't get angry. Anger is loud, and loud was exactly what they wanted. Instead, the next morning, I did what any business owner with a functioning brain does after hearing the word thief used about her by the family she's about to marry into. I called my attorney, not to attack anyone, but to protect what I'd built. I told her I was getting married. I told her what I'd heard. And she said the thing lawyers say that sounds cold until you need it. Fiona, you have a company worth 8 figures and no protection at all. So we fixed that before the wedding, not after. We kept my business assets clearly separate. We drafted a prenuptial agreement of my own. One that protected Slid grounds, my properties and my investments, the things I'd built with my grandmother's gloves in the glove box, from anyone who might one day decide they were family property. I'd watched too many women hand over everything they built just to keep the peace, and I decided I wasn't going to be one of them. If you've ever been made to feel greedy for wanting to keep what was yours, tell me in the comments and subscribe, because what I did with that document later is the whole reason I'm telling you this. I signed nothing that day. I simply made sure that whatever the Ashfords were planning, I would not walk into it empty-handed. I put the folder in a drawer and tried to forget it was there. I told myself I was being careful, not suspicious. I didn't yet know I would need it. I didn't yet know they were about to hand me a reason. I found out exactly what "what's left" meant on a Saturday at the lake house, looking for a powder room and opening the wrong door. It was the study, Margaret's private room, and I stepped inside before I realized where I was. The first thing I saw was the wall. There was a rectangle on it, a clean, bright shape in the middle of faded paneling, the exact outline and size of a large painting that was no longer there. I knew that shape. It was the ghost a picture leaves behind when it has hung somewhere for decades and then suddenly hasn't. Around the room were more of them, pale wounds where things used to be. A cabinet stood open and half empty. And on the desk, not hidden, just sitting there the way things sit in a house where no guest is ever supposed to wander, was a short stack of mail. The top envelope had a bank logo and a red stamp across it that I could read from the doorway. Past due. Beneath it was the corner of a glossy sheet, the kind auction houses send when estate items are being appraised. I stood very still with one hand in my coat pocket, and without deciding to, I closed my fingers around my grandmother's gloves, the way I always do when the ground beneath me stops feeling steady. And suddenly, the whole story turned over in my hands like a coin. They hadn't looked down on me because I had nothing. They had looked down on me because I had something real, growing and mine, and they were quietly, desperately running out. The portraits, the pearls, the name on the library wall. They were a beautiful front on an empty house. Margaret wasn't protecting a fortune from a gold digger. She was hiding the absence of one, and she needed a thief in the room so no one would look too closely at the vault. I backed out of the study, pulled the door shut, and stood in the hallway holding those gloves. And for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't afraid of them. After that door, every insult I had swallowed changed flavor in my mouth. The corrections about my forks. The survey over coffee. The way Margaret had examined my ring and called it practical as if the word itself were an insult. It had never been about protecting a legacy. There was no legacy left to protect. It was about controlling the story in the room, keeping everyone's eyes fixed on the poor, unsuitable woman Ethan had dragged home so nobody would count the empty spaces on the walls. And the strangest thing happened as I understood it. I stopped hating Margaret and, against my will, started seeing her. Later that same visit I passed the study again. The door was cracked and she was inside alone. She had taken down one of the empty frames and was polishing it, the glass covering nothing. Her hands moved in small, careful circles, but they were shaking. She didn't know I saw her. She would have died before she let me. And watching her, I understood that 40 years earlier she had walked into this family the same way I had, from somewhere with less, and they had measured her at the door too. She had spent 4 decades learning to become a wall so smooth that nobody could ever grip her the way they once had. She wasn't the author of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. She was terrified of the red stamps, the empty frames, and the day the town that still nodded at the Ashford name would stop nodding when it learned the truth. I felt something I hadn't planned to feel. Not forgiveness, recognition. She and I were more alike than either of us would ever admit. The difference was only this. She had a name and no money. I had money and no name. And one of us still believed that meant I was the one who brought nothing. You would think that, knowing what I knew, I would have left. That I would have looked at the empty frames, the shaking hands, and the words "gold digger," then walked out with my company and my dignity intact. I didn't. 'Cause I still loved Ethan. Really loved him. The gentle man from the snowy parking lot who had argued about books with me until his fingers went white. And because I still wanted the table. Even a table in a broke, frightened house. I still wanted a place at it. That's the part I'm least proud of and most honest about. Knowing they had nothing didn't cure me of wanting them. It only changed what I was afraid of. I decided I wouldn't use what I knew. I wouldn't walk into a dinner and announce that I'd seen the past due notices, that I knew the vault was empty, that the entire grand performance was being held together with pearls and nerve. That would have been cruelty for cruelty's sake, and their game played back at them would have won me nothing I actually wanted. I didn't want to humiliate them. I didn't want their money. I wanted something much harder to take from them. A place at the table. I didn't want to defeat Margaret. God help me, I still wanted her to like me. So I kept the secret, kept my folder in its drawer, and kept showing up smaller every time, hoping that if I was patient, good and quiet enough, the door would finally open on its own. I still believed I could earn my way in. I still thought welcome was something you could deserve your way into. I was about to learn that the door had never been closed to keep me out. It had been closed so they could choose the moment to open it, and make sure everyone was watching when they did. The ultimatum arrived dressed as a formality. 3 weeks before the wedding, Ethan told me while staring at his shoes, "Mom thinks we should have a prenup, just to make everyone comfortable. She's having Vivian's lawyer draw something up." I asked to see it, and when it arrived, I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was holding. It wasn't a prenup in any fair sense of the word. It was a surrender. In the event of a divorce, I would leave with nothing. Worse than nothing. The document defined everything I brought into the marriage as family property held in trust by the Ashfords. My business, my properties, the things I had built with my own 2 hands before I had ever heard the name Ashford. They wanted me to sign my life's work over to a family that was hiding red-stamped envelopes in a study. And the beautiful, insane logic of it was this. They still thought I was poor. They thought Slater Grounds was 1 truck and a seasonal job. This entire crushing document had been designed to protect their non-existent fortune from my non-existent one. They were reaching across the table to take assets they didn't believe existed from a woman they had already decided was after theirs. It would have been funny if it hadn't been aimed at the one thing in the world that was truly mine. I sat with that document for a long time. I didn't call my lawyer. Not yet. I wanted to see how far they would take it. I wanted to see whether the man I loved would go there with them. So I placed their prenup in the same drawer as mine, 2 folders sitting side by side, and waited for the Ashfords to show me exactly who they were. I gave Ethan the chance to be the man I hoped he was. I laid their document flat on our kitchen table, where he couldn't pretend not to see it, and asked him one question. "Do you know what this says?" He read it. I watched his face, waiting for the anger, the flush, the moment he would crumple it in his fist and say, "Absolutely not. You're not signing this. This isn't happening." But he read it and he grew quiet. Then he said the words that ended something between us, something I'm not sure ever fully came back. "Just sign it," he said. "It's only paper. You and I both know we'll never get divorced, so it doesn't matter what it says. Sign it, make her comfortable, and then we can just be happy." I looked at the man I loved across my own kitchen table, and understood that he was asking me to sign my grandmother's gloves away to make his mother comfortable, to hand over everything I had built on paper so a woman who called me a thief could feel that she had one. "It's only paper," he said, the way people say things when they've never had to build anything and therefore can't imagine losing it. But it wasn't only paper to me. It was every early morning in the snow. It was my grandmother's hands. And the man who was supposed to stand in front of me had just asked me to lie down. I kept my voice level and my hands still. I told him I would think about it, and that night I finally understood, completely and without any room left for denial, the thing I had been running from my whole life. Nobody was ever going to hand me a place at the table. Not even him. That night I couldn't sleep. And so I did the one thing I had never allowed myself to do. I looked straight at my own life. I saw a 29-year-old girl in a rented duplex learning that the way to keep people was to need them and never threaten them. I saw a young woman hiding her first real money like it was something shameful. I saw myself paying for dinners and letting the flints show, dressing down, driving a dented truck on purpose, and telling every person I loved a version of myself that was smaller than the truth so they wouldn't leave. And I saw where it had brought me, to a kitchen table at 34, being asked to sign away the one thing I had never made smaller, my company, in order to keep a family that had never once chosen me. The armor hadn't protected me. The armor was the wound. I had spent my whole life making myself small enough to be loved, and the smaller I made myself, the less there was of me for anyone to actually love. So I made myself smaller still, feeding the very thing I was starving from. I'd done it with friends. I'd done it with the boyfriend who once told me I made him feel small. And now I was doing it with the Ashfords, sanding myself down to fit a chair at a table in an empty house. My grandmother hadn't raised me to be small. She had raised me to build. She wore those gloves like a crown, and somewhere along the way, I had taken everything she gave me and hidden it in a glove box, ashamed, as if worth were something I had to apologize for. I lay there in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time I stopped apologizing. In the morning I called my attorney, and this time it was different. The last time I had been protecting myself out of fear. This time I was doing something quieter and harder to name. I asked her to prepare a full financial disclosure, everything. The real numbers, the company valuation, the properties, the investment accounts, all of it, laid out plainly on paper for anyone who cared to read. I also asked her to finalize my own prenuptial agreement, the one that protected what I had built, and to add one plain page of legal fact at the front. She asked me what I was planning to do with it. I told her the truth. I didn't know yet. I only knew I was tired of being the poor woman in a story other people were writing. If there was going to be a document on a table, it was not going to be only theirs. My lawyer walked me through the law, calm and precise, and I wrote everything down. A prenuptial agreement pushed on someone under pressure, without their own attorney, without full and honest disclosure of both sides' assets, is not worth the paper it's printed on. Can be challenged. Protects no one. She told me that a fair prenup requires both people to disclose their real numbers openly, with enough time to think and independent counsel to advise them. Their document did none of that. It was a piece of theater, and bad theater at that. I put my folder together, the disclosure, my agreement, and the one-page legal explanation. Then I set it by the door. I didn't know if I would open it. I only knew I would not walk in without it. Vivian let it slip, the way people let things slip when they want you to know and cannot admit they want you to know. We were confirming numbers for the rehearsal dinner when she mentioned casually that it would be a full room. 60 people. All the important ones, she said. Everyone will be there to witness you joining the family. She smiled when she said it, and the smile had teeth. I went home and sat with that sentence. Witness you joining the family. 60 people. The important ones. And I understood what the rehearsal dinner was going to be. It wasn't a dinner. It was a stage. They were going to hand me their document in front of 60 of the oldest names in the county, at the exact moment when refusing would look like the tantrum of an ungrateful gold digger. They had chosen the audience on purpose. A woman alone at a kitchen table can say no. But a woman surrounded by 60 watching faces, one day before her wedding, with a man she loves looking at her hopefully, is supposed to be too ashamed to refuse. Public was their weapon. Shame was the pen they meant to put in my hand. And sitting there I realized something that surprised me. Public could work the other way too. If they wanted 60 witnesses, they were going to get 60 witnesses, but not to what they had planned. I didn't decide to humiliate them. I want to be clear about that because it matters to how this ends. I decided only that whatever happened in that room was going to happen in the light. And for the first time in my life I was going to be exactly my full size. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I sat alone at my kitchen table with two things in front of me. My grandmother's gloves and the folder by the door. I didn't rehearse a speech. For once in my life, I didn't practice being anyone. I simply sat with the quiet and asked myself what I actually wanted beneath the desire to belong, beneath the 2 years of shrinking. And when the answer came, it was simple, and it cost me something to say it, even to an empty room. I wanted to be able to look at myself. That was all. Not to win. Not to destroy them. Not even to be let in anymore. I wanted to walk out of tomorrow able to face the woman who had built 40 trucks out of one. The woman my grandmother had raised. Everything I had done for 2 years had been a slow trade of that woman for a chair. And I was done trading. I picked up the gloves, held them to my face, and breathed in the leather and the memory. Then I made myself a promise in my grandmother's voice. Whatever happens tomorrow, I will not walk into that room as anyone smaller than I am. I didn't know yet whether I would marry Ethan. That's the honest truth. I loved him and I didn't know. I didn't know if a man who could ask me to sign away my life to soothe his mother could ever learn to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. But I knew one thing with total clarity as I sat there in the dark with the gloves against my cheek. I was done auditioning. The part had never been mine to earn. And finally, after 34 years, I was going to stop trying. The club was beautiful in the way a stage set is beautiful if you know where to look. I looked. The flowers on the tables were silk, not fresh, dressed up beneath the lights so most people wouldn't notice. There were half as many staff as a room that size should have had. The chandeliers had been dimmed to a flattering gold that also conveniently softened the worn spots on the carpet and the water stain near the ceiling. 60 of the oldest names in the county sat at round tables in their finest jewelry, and every one of them believed they were dining in the house of old money. I knew better now. I knew the entire room was being held together by nerve, silk flowers, and a name on a library wall. Margaret worked the room like she was performing the role of her entire life. Radiant, gracious, touching elbows, calling people darling. Vivian orbited her, while at the far end of the head table sat Gerald Ashford, Ethan's father, a quiet man I had barely heard speak in 2 years. He was watching me, not the way the others watched me with polite arithmetic, but the way you watch whether you're not sure about. And when our eyes met, he didn't look away. There was something in his face that almost looked like an apology, one he didn't have the courage to say out loud. I took my seat and set my small clutch in my lap. Inside my coat, folded flat, was my folder. Their document was already on the table, tucked beneath Margaret's place setting where she thought I couldn't see it, waiting for its moment. My grandmother's gloves were in my pocket. 60 people lifted their glasses, and I understood that the dinner had already begun, and that everyone in the room was about to get exactly what they came for, just not in the way they expected. It happened between the salad and the toast. Margaret stood, tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room went soft and attentive, the way rooms do for a woman like her. She thanked everyone for coming, then offered a few gracious words about family, legacy, and the importance of protecting what generations had built. And then, still smiling and still radiant, she reached beneath her place setting, pulled out the document, and slid it across the white tablecloth until it came to rest directly in front of me. "There is just one small family matter to attend to first," she said, her voice carrying to the back tables exactly as she had trained it to for 40 years. "Fiona, dear, before you join this family, we need you to sign this." She let the pause linger, and then, so not one of the 60 guests could miss it, she said the thing she had been waiting 2 years to say. "Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family." The room did not gasp. Did something worse. Held still. 60 of the oldest names in the county sat with their forks halfway to their mouths, every eye fixed on me, and I could feel the verdict already forming on their faces. The old easy verdict about the woman with the truck, no famous family, and the audacity to reach too high. Ethan had gone white beside me. Vivian watched with the small, hungry stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time for a show. Margaret stood over me, gracious and merciless, holding out a pen. I looked down at the document on the tablecloth. Then I looked up at her and did the one thing she was not prepared for. I smiled, picked up the pen, and did not sign. Instead, I began reading aloud. Calmly, clearly, and directly into the silence of that room, I read their document to the 60 witnesses they had so thoughtfully assembled. "In the event of dissolution of the marriage," I read, "the party of the second part shall relinquish all claim to assets and shall convey any and all property, business interests, and holdings brought into the marriage to the Ashford Family Trust." I paused and looked up. "That's me," I said. "The party of the second part. Everything I bring into this marriage is to be signed over to your family forever. Is that right, Margaret?" Her smile flickered just slightly because this was not the script. In her version, I was supposed to cry, flee, or scrawl my name across the page in shame. Instead, I was reading her own weapon back to her, slowly and clearly, so everyone could hear exactly what the gracious Ashfords were demanding from the woman they had called worthless. I kept the pen in my hand and let them watch me hold it over the signature line. I felt the entire room lean forward. 60 people were certain they were about to watch a gold digger sign away her surrender. Ethan whispered my name, half plea and half warning. Margaret lifted her chin with something that looked like triumph, while Gerald, at the far end of the table, set down his glass very carefully, as if he had seen something the rest of them had not. I let the moment stretch until it became almost unbearable. "It's a generous document," I said quietly. "It really does account for everything I'm bringing to this family." Then I set the pen down beside their document and did not sign it. In the confused, breathing silence that followed, I reached into my coat and pulled out a plain manila folder. I placed it on the table in front of me. "There's just one thing it's missing," I said. I opened my folder the way you open a door you have kept locked for a long time, without hurry because there is no longer any reason to rush. I took out the first page and laid it face up on the tablecloth, where the light could reach it. "It's missing the other party's disclosure," I said. "A fair agreement shows both people's numbers. So let me show you mine." I began to read, still calm and still quiet, and the numbers started filling the room like water rising in a low place. I read the numbers aloud, and the room slowly began to understand what they meant. Slater Grounds. Commercial landscaping and snow removal. 40 vehicles. 90 employees. Contracts across 3 counties. Then I read the valuation of my company, and somewhere behind me, a fork touched a plate and stopped. I read the properties I owned outright. I read the investment accounts. One by one, I laid the pages face up on the table, a plain paper trail of a life I had built with my own hands. With every page, the arithmetic in that room ran backward, and then completely broke. These were not the numbers of a gold digger with a truck. They were the numbers of a woman who could have bought the club, the lake house, and the name carved into the library wall and still had money left over. "You said I bring nothing to this family," I said, looking directly at Margaret, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Then let's take a look at what nothing looks like." At the far end of the head table, Gerald Ashford, the quiet man who was the only person in the room who truly knew what the family accounts contained, placed both hands flat on the table and half rose from his chair, staring at my documents. He understood before anyone else what those numbers meant. He understood that the woman his wife had just called worthless was the only financially secure person at that table. He understood which family was actually marrying up. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair without taking his eyes off me. And this is where they thought the story would end. They expected me to slide my own document across the table and crush them with it in front of 60 witnesses, to expose the empty house, the red-stamped envelopes, the shaking hands, and everything I had discovered. It would have been easy. It would even have been justified. But it would also have made me exactly what they had accused me of being. Someone who came to that table only to take. So I didn't. Instead, I took out the final page of my folder, my own prenuptial agreement, the one that protected everything I had built from anyone who might one day decide it belonged to them. I didn't read it to the room. I simply placed it on the table and said quietly, "I brought a document too. Mine protects what I made from anyone who ever decides it's theirs." I was going to sign it and marry into this family anyway because, for 2 years, I wanted to belong here more than I wanted to be safe. Then I stood up. I stood in front of 60 of the oldest names in the county at my own rehearsal dinner, and I set the pen down for good. "I'm not going to sign yours," I told Margaret. "And I'm not going to marry your family. I never was." Then I turned to Ethan and said the truest thing I had ever spoken aloud. "I'll marry you at the courthouse on Tuesday, with nothing changing hands but a promise and no one's name on it but ours. Or I'll wish you a good life and go build mine. But I am done earning a seat at a table that put a price on me. Choose now, Ethan. Not for her. For you." The room went completely silent. In a single breath, I had given up the wedding I had dreamed of, the family I had spent 2 years shrinking myself to join, and possibly the man I loved. And I want you to understand something. For the first time in my entire life, standing there believing I might have lost everything, I felt exactly my full size. Ethan stood. For a long moment, he looked at his mother. Then he looked at me, and I watched 36 years of learning to stay quiet collide with something braver underneath. He did something I had never once seen him do. He walked around the table, past his mother's outstretched hand, came to my side, and took my hand in front of everyone. Then he turned to Margaret and said, his voice shaking but holding steady, "You just showed me exactly what this family values." Margaret, who had controlled that room like a stage her entire life, finally lost control of the performance. Her composure cracked, and the truth came out in a hiss meant for me but loud enough for the people at the nearest tables to hear. "You have no idea," she said, "what it costs to keep this family's name." And for just 1 second I felt it. The 40 years, the empty frames, the red-stamped envelopes, the fear behind the pearls, and the impossible burden of preserving a name that had become more valuable than the people carrying it. I felt it. The 40 years, the empty frames, the shaking hands, the woman who had once been measured at a door too, and who had never stopped bleeding from it. I did not hate Margaret, but I did not sit back down either. Gerald caught my eye from the far end of the table and gave me the smallest nod, a quiet man's apology and blessing at once. Then I picked up my folder and my grandmother's gloves, took Ethan's hand, and walked out of that beautiful dimly lit room filled with silk flowers and old names, my full size at last. We were married on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I wore a simple dress with my grandmother's gloves folded inside my pocket, and Ethan wore his good coat, the one with the mended elbow. 2 of my crew stood beside us as witnesses, the men who had helped build my life, the same people Margaret had once said they would see about space for. There were no silk flowers, no 60 watching faces doing arithmetic, no family performance. There was only a clerk, a promise, and nothing changing hands. Gerald came. He stood quietly at the back of the small room, just as he had watched me from the head table that night. Afterward, he took both of my hands in his rough, aging ones and held them for a moment. "We were the ones marrying up," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud." Margaret did not come, and I had not expected her to. But standing in that plain, bright courthouse, I realized I did not need her to. The table I had spent 2 years trying to earn my way into had turned out to be nothing more than a stage in an empty house, and finally, I had walked off it and into a marriage where I could be my full self, with room to spare. It was the smallest wedding in the history of the Ashford name, and it was the first honest one. The lake house sold that autumn. The Ashford name remained carved over the library entrance, just as it always had, but the town soon learned what had been hiding behind it, the way towns always do. I did not lift a finger to save the Ashfords, and I did not lift one to destroy them either. I let them keep their name, their debts, and their empty frames, because their story was no longer mine to write. Slater Grounds expanded into 2 more counties that year. Ethan kept teaching history, and slowly, painfully, he learned how to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. We bought a house with money I had built with my own hands, and we put both our names on it. Separate, clear, and honest, everything in the open, the way a fair agreement should be. He never asked me to be smaller again, and I never again had to pretend I was anything less than exactly what my grandmother had raised me to be. I hung her old leather gloves on the wall of my new office, framed in the spot where the morning light reaches them first. They were no longer hidden in a glove box. They were not shameful. They were not small. They were right there in the open, where anyone who came to talk business could see them. Cracked, soft, worn from decades of work, and worth more to me than every painting that had ever hung in the Ashford study. Sometimes before the crews roll out and the trucks leave for the day's work, I stand there and look at them. I think about that empty rectangle on Margaret's wall, the ghost of something she sold to keep a name alive. And then I think about what I put in its place. She spent her life defending a wall with nothing behind it. I spent mine feeling ashamed of everything I had built. In the end, only one of us learned to put her worth where the light could reach it. And that is the only lesson I took from all of this. Worth is not something you inherit from a table someone else sets. It is something you build with your own 2 hands. And no one, no matter whose name is carved over a library, gets to slide it back across the tablecloth and call it nothing. That's my story. A folder I almost never opened, a pen I picked up and then put down, and a name I finally stopped trying to earn. So if anyone has ever made you feel like you brought nothing to the table, go look at what you built with your own 2 hands, and count it out loud. Do it today. And if this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.